And I'm joined today by Charna Parkey. Hello, Charna.
Hello, hello. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? Somebody mentioned earlier that she could tell I had my third cup of coffee. And she was right. This is literally my third cup of coffee. I just finished it. So ready to go, even though I don't really need it. But
I will probably have 10 cups of coffee today. Not that I should, but I always make the full pot and then I just keep because it gets cold. And so you like top it off and top it off and top it off. And then at some point you're like, how did I drink 10 cups of coffee? It's going to be a fun live stream.
yeah, I agree. So with that, hello everybody. And just to mention real quick as we get started, separate from here on Groudcast, we're also simulcasting on Twitter Live, or I should say X Live, LinkedIn Live, and YouTube Live. So everybody, we're kind of across the streams right now, and I see a bunch of folks coming in. I saw Canada and Phoenix. Where's everybody from? We'd love to know kind of what part of the world you're from. And Hugh Brown, I see scorcher in Toronto at 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I will take that any day of the week here in Florida, where it is regularly in the 90s without the humidity. Oh, we have Poland,
This is why I left
Morocco.
Florida.
How far north did you go?
Oh, I'm up in Seattle now. My when I left, 2015, my mom was like, "Could you have moved farther away?" And I said, "Mom, Alaska." And she was like, "Okay, I will visit you in Seattle."
Point taken. Point taken.
Point taken.
Oh, I see Idaho and Houston and Germany. A couple Germans. Hello, hello,
Oh,
Philadelphia.
Idaho.
Awesome. All right, and just so you know,
Nice.
everybody, as we're just taking just a couple minutes for folks to get into the live stream. Don't worry, we will start at 5 sharp. In the meantime, what we can do is let's go ahead and start with a poll, right? So I'm gonna start a poll and at the same time do a little housekeeping with everybody. So hopefully you see that poll show up, but if not, take a look to the right side of your screen. You should see like a little menu bar here in Crowdcast, and you'll see a little toolbar. One of those will be polls. You'll also see a Q&A section. So if at any point you want to ask us a question or something about the material, about RAG, whatever, put it in the Q&A because it allows the other attendees to vote them up. We'll kind of, it's easier for us to kind of manage them that way. So you may notice that if you do ask a question in the chat, I'll probably ask you to put it in the Q&A. But yeah, try to keep them over there if you can. Feel free to chat with everybody else. And let's see, I already see some people answering on the poll. So the question we just asked was, what GenAI frameworks are you using to build? And I'm no surprise, I see a bunch of people coming with LangChain. Some with Langflow, that's super cool. I'm glad to hear that. No something else as yet, though.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I've
Right?
heard at least a lot of JavaScript developers tend to roll their own or are trying out LangChain.js. I met someone yesterday that didn't know that LangChain.js existed, and I was like, huh.
Oh, yeah. I actually just learned that myself recently, and I do code in JavaScript along with Python and others. But I'm not focused. Honestly, I'm not focused right now on JavaScript. I'm more focused on Python. But I was
Yeah.
just at the AI World's Fair, and I did learn about that. I actually learned that from we had Harrison Chase out for an event and from LangChain, and so just through conversation, I was like, oh, that's a thing. That's like super cool. I was like very excited about that. All right, let's see how that poll's going. Oh, something else? For the person who mentioned something else, I'd love to know what that something else is, right? Why don't you pop it in the chat? I'm very curious to know what that is. And funny enough, we have our first QA question, but we'll take those as we go. Alrighty, well, cool. Well, that keep answering the poll as we go for those who come on in, because it helps give us context while we're here chatting. And by the way, Charna, I did mention
Yes.
I'm a developer relations engineer here at
Oh,
DataStax. So I've been a coder and a DBA for almost 30 years. I've coded in a bunch of different languages. Obviously, these days I'm super focused on GenAI, helping people learn how to build GenAI apps and that kind of deal. Like, what do you do? Because you have a very special set of knowledge, right?
yeah. So I am the VP of product strategy and operations of RAGStack at DataStax, and that's our curated, tested, open source stack for GenAI. However, my background is in AI and machine learning. I've been in this space for 20 years. My first job while I was still in college was using AI. My PhD is in digital signal processing. So I think I've been working with transformer models since it was just an academic exercise, and I was, trying
Are these
to
the
get it
ones
to work.
that are more than meets the eye, or is that something else? Right? Is that I just made a Transformers joke. If it just totally fell flat, like I grew up in the 80s, come on, I can't help it.
All right. So what you and everyone in the audience should know about me is like sarcasm is hard for me to detect. We used to at work have to have people like do this so that I could tell that there was a joke in there somewhere. I will do my best. But yes, Transformers. No, not that form. Oh man.
Alrighty. So with that, I think we're at a good point to go ahead and get started. We have a good amount of folks in and everything like that. So let's do it. So here's what we're going to do today. All right. I am going to just start off with a very quick demo, just like 5 minutes or less, to kind of go through a very basic RAG pipeline to kind of illustrate what it does and why it works, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to move over to Charna, and Charna is going to bring down the learning hammer, and she is going to impart all sorts of really great knowledge and such. And then we're going to go into a little bit of deeper dive and what we're doing from the RAG pipeline and such like that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And once I do this, if I could get some thumbs up that you all are actually seeing my screen, that would be great. Make sure that it looks good. And if anybody has, oh, wonderful. Yep. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jules. Okay, great. Great. I always like to make sure that like what I'm talking about actually shows up. That's always useful. Okay, so, since this is a live stream where we're looking at both RAGStack and Langflow, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to say if I go to RAGStack itself, right, this is just the main doc page for RAGStack. Now, RAGStack is a collection of various libraries that are curated and tested and such. They're really, especially, for those enterprise devs out there, I don't think it's limited to enterprise devs, but for those folks that really want to ensure that the libraries that they're working with are going to work, right? That's kind of a key thing. There's a lot moving right now in GenAI. There's a lot of projects out there, open source projects, lots of code being slung, lots of things moving very fast. So RAGStack kind of gives you a set of libraries that are, again, curated and stable, right? So Charna will talk more about that a little bit later. But what I want to point out here is that in these Python packages, I'll just zoom in a little bit more, right? You can see there is the base RAGStack-AI. This would be like I do a pip install RAGStack-AI. But there are variations on this. And one of those is this RAGStack AI Langflow, right? So I'm going to go ahead and go down to the Langflow section, just open this up. I have a terminal right here. And now, for full disclosure, because I've set a couple things up for you all today, I have pre-installed everything. But I'm still going to run through it as if I was doing it new. I did create a virtual environment here in Python. I do really recommend that. We can argue the finer points of that later. But I like having kind of a compartmentalized section where I have my deploy. And you can see I'm just doing my pip install ragstack-ai-langflow. I'll actually blow this up a little bit. Now, for what I have set up today, I am sticking my version at 106, which is one of the very latest ones. If you were installing this fresh, no need to worry about that. Just pip install ragstack-ai-langflow. Okay, now you hit it. You can see, again, I pre-installed the libraries. If you were to do this yourself, it takes a couple minutes. There's a lot of libraries, especially to support all the various models and everything. But that's it. You need this one library, and it has been curated to give you the full RAGStack AI complement plus Langflow. And then once I'm there, I can just say Langflow run, and that should pop up in my browser here in a second. Jason, for the graininess that if anyone else can confirm, sometimes that does happen on the Crowdcast. You might have to give it a moment. We are streaming in HD, so okay. All right. Okay, great. So Langflow is now up and running. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to gloss over all the details here, and I'm just going to dig into the RAG pipeline kind of demo portion so you can get an idea of what's going on. Now, there are really two pieces to this. So if I were to go into Langflow and start here and say new project, and then use this vector store RAG template, that's what you're seeing between these two. These are just slight variations on that template. And in this template, it actually contains two flows. One flow is the query flow that we're going to use to ask questions of our LLM once we have data in our RAG store. The other one is going to be the generative flow where we're going to generate the data we're going to store in our RAG pipeline. Okay. Now, like I said, I'm purposely glossing over a bunch of details, so don't worry about the individual components. If you're not familiar with RAG or whatever, we will absolutely dig into all of that. Here's what I want you to point out, or I want you to focus on. Let's pretend for a second that I'm in ChatGPT and I ask a question, when did I start coding? Now, what do you all think is going to happen here when I ask this question, right? There's a very good chance that ChatGPT isn't going to have an idea what I'm talking about. Right. And as you can see in its response, I'll zoom in a little bit. Okay. You'll see that the response is, I don't have the information of when you started coding. Can you provide more details? I mean, how would it? Like the large language models are like trained on all this knowledge from the internet, but they don't have my domain knowledge, right? They don't know much about me unless it was already out there in the internet. So right now, with its current context, it really just doesn't know anything about me. Now, I'm going to pull this open here. Now, in this particular RAG pipeline, what I do want to point out, and I'll blow this one up a little bit too. Hopefully, you can see my database on the right-hand side. This is using AstroDB. This is part of the DataStax stack. So this is a fully fledged vector store. And I've created a collection here called RAGStack demo. But it's empty. I haven't put anything in it, right? And I've done that on purpose. So what I'm going to do is just to kind of demonstrate here that these are the same. This top workflow you see here is actually the query workflow, right? And you can say I have the same question. So I have no data in here. I'm just going to ask it the same question. When did I start coding? And again, it should pretty much say something like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And it says, I'm sorry, there's not enough information provided. Because again, the LLM doesn't have any context. So here's what I want to do. Let's go ahead and this is the generative part. So I'm going to load up some file. In this case, it's just a PDF. It happens to be a PDF that I built a while ago. It's on my career progression, funny enough. But here's why. This is my domain knowledge. I did actually look like that. I was actually really amazed at how well ChatGPT did in generating that image based off the description.
Nice.
Yeah, that was scarily close. But I started around 8 years old on a Commodore 64, right? And so this is information that in my domain that I have in this data that the LLMs don't have. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to feed that in. We're going to create embeddings off of that, and then we're going to store it in this RAGStack demo collection, right? So it's going to go pop through that. Again, I'm glossing over all sorts of details right now. We will get into them a little later. But what I really want to point out is now when I go to this RAGStack demo collection, you can see that I have some data. So it's taken the data from this PDF. It has put it into embedding through an embedding model, and I have vector embeddings now represent that data. So now if I pull back and if I ask that same question again, we should see a different answer. This is always fun doing this stuff live, right? Check this out. So the answer being you started coding when you were around 8 years old, learning how to code games on your Commodore 64, which is pretty much exactly what I talked about right here, right? So the whole idea here is that with this RAG pipeline, I am able to augment the LLM in real time, right? I didn't have to build a new model. I don't have to fine tune or anything. I can literally pull in relevant data real time and then apply it to the LLM, right? So anyway, I just wanted to start with that, kind of set the stage a little bit. I'm now going to hand it over to Charna to dig into some of the fun with RAG itself. And then we will come back and we'll do a deep dive into how this is actually working.
All right, let me switch to some slides. Now, as I mentioned before, David, feel free to interrupt and ask questions if I'm glossing over stuff that you think will be useful for this audience.
Oh, for sure.
I want to make a claim that you need RAG in your application. Now, is this true, right? Most of the times I would argue, yes, if you actually want to achieve something that's domain specific, personal, customized, LLMs are amazing, but they are expensive and they learn patterns, not exact, precise pieces of information. They're great at predicting statistically the next word that's going to come, but they're, even if your data was indexed on the internet, that's one page throughout everything that it's ingested. And so it's not enough representation to actually get that data to come back. So the way I want to justify this is by starting with some apps and talk to you about a little bit why they had to use RAG. So this first example is an app called Physics Walla. They're learning guru. They are an app, a personalized AI tutor application in India to assist students with their academic and support queries. Like, these are very, very, very technical questions that they're asking, and they're asking it in many different languages. They may be doing text to speech, they may be typing it in, but there are multiple different languages being supported. This application, when it started, was trying to just essentially chat with a PDF, not building up a vector store, not doing any kind of retrieval there, but just like, all right, the student's learning from this textbook. Can I just use a massive context window? Is that form of RAG enough? Turns out it's not. So one of the things that they did was they collected feedback for every answer that was given. You see those thumbs up and thumbs down. They were able to measure essentially customer satisfaction. And until they were actually able to chunk the data in the right way, to retrieve the right information, and to summarize that in a way that the user could actually make useful, their CSAT was very low, right? They started with, basic RAG, and then they had to move to more and more advanced techniques. And I want to bring this one up because physics is a very specific domain, but it's also out in the open, right? So if ChatGPT has indexed all of the textbooks for physics, why on earth can this not just answer the questions, right? It's not what transformer models are built for. Transformer models are built for learning patterns and concepts and not necessarily giving you exact matches to what you're asking. So I want to move to the next example. So Skypoint. Skypoint is a GenAI app that gives healthcare providers instant access to public and private data, and they offer this chat interface. They have strict SLAs, latency, throughput, cost, etc. But in particular, I want to tap in onto this healthcare data, right? If I go to ChatGPT and I ask it to interpret something, certainly I have done this for healthcare before. Like, my partner is having shoulder surgery soon, and we got this massive document that talks about his different options. I absolutely use ChatGPT for that. However, if you want to have very specific patient record recommendations where only this patient's health history and only the medications that they're using and all of these types of things are used for these types of contexts, you absolutely need to be using RAG, because these are not general things. It's not okay to substitute one medication with another because it's close. Like, you absolutely need to be doing something with RAG on this private data and not just, putting it out on the internet. And the last example I'm going to give is this app called Omam Health. Again, it has something to do with healthcare, but it's doing RAG in a different way. This application, before they had GenAI, was an application for women who were trying to get pregnant or were struggling with fertility to get answers from doctors. There was this network of doctors that you could submit your question and it would go out to their entire network and provide those answers back. But oftentimes it would take a week to get a response, right? These are not doctors that are getting paid for every single response. It's sort of a volunteer network, and they're trying to help people with fertility. Well, what if we could retrieve that medical advice for my specific case, for my age, for my demographic group, for my particular challenge, But we cannot do this simply with LLMs. We have to do this with RAG because the attribution of this medical advice to the doctor is critically important, right? I can't change what this advice is to just hallucinate something from the internet. So my argument here is that if you're doing any sort of vertical specific transformative application, RAG is key. Fine-tuning is expensive, and it's not going to learn your specific data. It's going to learn a pattern. Few-shot learning is great when you're trying to teach it something structured, like here's exactly how to extract or here's how to format your question and answer, but it's not going to get you what you need for something transformative in your domain. So everyone is sort of settling on the same pattern, RAG, retrieval-augmented generation. And what we've noticed is it's the key piece. It's the piece that isn't really replaceable. You can replace an LLM if you need a multimodal LLM or you want a smaller LLM. You can pop those in and out. And it doesn't it's a trade-off you can make for cost, or it's a trade-off you can make for relevancy. But without the data, you don't really have that application. And chat with PDFs are not really going to change the world. So this seems simple, right? Go give me my data, put it into the LLM, but there's actually different kinds of data. And we need to consider all kinds of data in order to get the right context at the right time to answer questions. So sure, we've got the user input. I can just ask the user, well, when did you start coding? And you would give it that information, right? But yeah. What do we want to do with scale? What are we going to do when we want to deploy this to all kinds of users, to many different students, to many different patients, right? We need more than just that user input. We need to somehow back that with unstructured data, with semi-structured data, and then with fully structured data. And these different kinds of data is going to bring different kinds of context into the prompt. So when we're thinking about this RAG problem, it can get relatively complex. And it can actually get kind of confusing. And so part of why we want to make this really easy is because we can, right? We know what patterns are working. We know what you're going to want to experiment with. And so this is why Langflow exists, right? How are we going to build these applications? Well, we're not all experts in coding. We're not all experts in these RAG patterns. But what we do know is that we need for our domain to get the right answers, right? If I'm an agronomist and I want to build a tool that tells farmers what to do with their crops, I don't need to know how to code. But anyone trying to build an application can do it quickly with a drag and drop interface. And we want to make this available with those templates that you talked about to make it quite easy. So start with simple RAG. And then when you're not quite getting the results that you want, move to something like graph RAG, or start to implement something like keyword searching or hybrid searching to get even better results. So David will go into this later, but I wanted to kind of say, like, this is why Langflow. Now, there were some questions in the chat about RAGStack. What is RAGStack? We refer to these different abstractions. And what do we mean by that, right? So RAGStack, as we've mentioned, is a curated open source stack. We take different abstractions from different places. So the Llama Index framework has a different abstraction than the LangChain framework, has a different abstraction than the Langflow framework. So the abstractions that you saw in Langflow are going to help you build rapidly. But maybe you want to have more control. So you want to drop down into code. Well, behind each of those little boxes on the screen, you can drop down into LangChain. Yeah. But maybe you really prefer Llama Index, because I know, at least for me, the academics in my life love Llama Index, right? The documentation is amazing. The way that they're testing the RAG patterns are great. And for our application developers, they prefer LangChain. So we're providing this testing between all of the stack, your database, your embedding providers, your LLMs, your platforms like Vertex AI and Azure ML. All of that is already in the stack. And when we talk about these abstractions, these are the different abstractions that you have access to. You can use any of them in order to build these RAG applications. And our goal is to serve every AI app creator, no matter your coding expertise, because I believe that it's going to be the domain experts that are going to revolutionize the way we work, the way we think about our experiences, right? You are the folks that are on the ground doing every single day what you do. You're a professor and you know exactly how you want to change the way we learn. You are a farmer and you know exactly what you need in order to get this farm producing crops in a way that's healthy for the land. Well, why don't you go ahead and build that? So that's the why. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're accelerating these use cases, right? It's not just what David had said. Sure, we've got vector similarity. That's one form of RAG. But there's also graph RAG, where you have non-semantically similar information that you need to pull back into the context. You may need to do a full text search. You may need to do these various things. And there's more to RAG than meets the eye. I'll give you just 2 examples before I hand it back over to David so that he can go into a deeper demo that he's going to explain more about Langflow. This first example is a support bot. So the article on the left is about a very specific phone, and it's saying, how do I change the volume? You'll notice on step 4, there's this link, ensure that do not disturb switch is turned off. Now, as you can imagine, there are an infinite number of phones out there. I mean, not technically infinite, but it seems that way. And so what if the LLM only got the text on the left and it just hallucinated for you how to turn do not disturb off? It would not only lose my confidence in Verizon as a support bot, but also I would be very frustrated if somebody said, like, here's how you turn off do not disturb, and that's not where it was on my phone. So graph is a way where we can relate 2 pieces of information. We can relate them in any way that we want to. We can take that link and add it as an edge to our vector chunks and say, well, why don't you pull back both of these pieces of text when you're doing your retrieval? So this is something that is available in RAGStack. It's something that we're continuing to innovate on every day. And when I say graph RAG, I don't mean the old traditional knowledge graphs that need ontology and experts to build them. I mean GenAI optimized specific graphs that helps you do this fast and easy.
So actually, I want to dig in on that a little bit, Tarna. So you're saying like separate from like a graph database or something like that you don't need that here, that it's the way that is it in your metadata, your embeddings? Like, where's this information being encapsulated?
Yeah, so it could be that you've got very long PDFs and you need to chunk that in order to get the right, snippet to return. But that snippet, that chunk that's returned doesn't have all of the context. So this edge, this linkage could be, it was in the same document, or these chunks were on the same page. You could say keywords matter, right? Maybe, I need to always traverse when there's a specific amenity being mentioned in a hotel, and I want to pull all of these back. You can create edges in any way, and you can store these in Astra alongside of your vector chunks, right? So it's just adding metadata of any kind, links, keywords, notations, same blood type, things like this, to allow you to pull back seemingly unrelated information.
Okay, that's awesome.
And then the last example I want to give you is this one on something called Colbert.
Sure, it's not Colbert, no. Is it Colbert or Colbert?
I wish somebody could tell me the answer to this one. I say Bert just because Bert is capitalized, and then I've tried out Colbert because that's the way my brain wants to say it. But people kind of look at me sideways, like, Sharna, what are you talking about?
I've had this argument now so many times with folks. Which one is it, right? I think this is going to be one of those that's just never solved, really.
If y'all would like to argue about it in the chat, please do. Especially those that have a lot of importance on like the philosophical debates, which I tend to love to have, but not on a day-to-day basis. So this is a real-world example. So we indexed over 1,000 Wikipedia articles with both this Ada DPR embedding model on the left. It's a pretty standard embedding model for vector, and a Colbert embedding model on the right. It's very different. It isn't the same as the sparse density of information being embedded on the left. It is very dense. And so what happens is, I think I said that opposite. Dense passage retrieval is when you have a lot of text into a single vector. And sparse passage retrieval is when you have very short amounts of text retrieved and matched multiple times. The whole point, though, is that when you need to have a named entity recognized, when you specifically need to know this medication, this person's name, and you need to retrieve that accurately, vector search isn't the way to do that. That's semantic similarity. And in fact, every time you embed the question, it's going to be a slightly different embedding when you ask that question. So you're not going to get the level of information in that vector encoding that you need. So you'll notice on the left, when you just do normal embedding, you search for this person's name, William H. Herndon, and everything that comes back is completely unrelated. The name isn't there at all. But when you use these other techniques, when you do this search with a Colbert embedding model before retrieving the information, you get the exact name that you're looking for. So it's a complex space, but it's actually rapidly evolving. And so part of what David is going to show you is how to do this with RAGStack Langflow. It is simply Langflow, but it is the tested stable version. So the versioning will often be behind the open source, but it will be fully tested with the stack, all of the other abstractions to ensure that what you're building is going to work in production.
By the way, we were having this discussion about Colbert and Colbert in the chat, and you got to check it out, Charna, because there's some funny comments about friend's pronunciation. So, by the way, right before we get into the demo, what we're going to do is we are going to give you another poll. So I'm going to remove the other poll we had. And by the way, it is very interesting that it looks like at least here the majority of you are in fact using LangChain. And what's cool, and Charna mentioned this, right? But Langflow itself is built on LangChain. It's not limited to LangChain, but in a sense, it's kind of like a UI abstraction on top of it. So as I show you some of the underlying components, I'll get into some of the code of some of them, and you'll see the LangChain callouts there. You should be seeing, by the way, a new poll. Now, this one's a little chunky, but given everything that Charna just talked about, right, we're curious, like, what kind of data are you injecting into the prompt context? Is it general knowledge? Is it really detailed information? Is it hyperlinked support articles? I see somebody just answered chunks from very long PDFs, numerical data, multi-model, right? And what we're curious about here is, like, what is the continuum that you're all on? Because what Charna was just getting at a moment ago is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. I'm also going to mention some of this as we go through the RAG pipeline. So go ahead and answer that poll, and I will pop over. I'm going to share my screen here and do this, and we'll get into the demo, the second part of the demo, I should say. All righty. Oh, go ahead, Charna. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, while you're getting that ready, I was going to answer this question. So there's a question on data files for RAG. How many files and up to what size files can be uploaded here to use RAG? I have a client who has 24 files with up to 150 megabytes that we need to build a RAG for. Great question. I have uploaded more than 59 gigabytes to do a RAG application before across many different document types. Think about indexing every hotel in the world and every restaurant in the world in order to give travel recommendations. So how many can you do? It's pretty limitless. And it does depend on your database, right? Like not every vector database is created equal, but Astra absolutely can scale to handle a couple dozen files and a couple hundred megabytes and into the beyond, right? Did we index all of Wikipedia?
Yes, actually.
I think that's actually made available. And there's also this other cool.
It's a really good point, actually. And matter of fact, it even the app. I don't remember the URL off the top of my head. Maybe we can find it while we're going through. But it real time listens for any changes to Wikipedia and automatically then adds them into the RAG store and updates any context of a particular document. Right. So it's pretty darn real time. You can actually interact with it as things are being added. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that one.
Well, there's also that Swifty GPT, which I really love too, where you could chat with Taylor Swift. But I also have a podcast called Open Source Data, and I would love to go chat with myself sometimes. I know that sounds weird, but sometimes, especially when we're doing something live like this, and especially
Yeah,
when I get into a conversation, I don't actually remember everything that I've said. Um, and so I just have to trust my producer to, edit the right things or not.
that's great.
And I would kind of like to know, could you summarize the points I made in this episode just for that checkpoint?
Funny enough, I'm not going to show it now, but there is actually a component in Langflow that somebody built that allows you to pull the transcripts from YouTube videos.
Yeah.
And for me, as a content creator, that's actually pretty relevant, right? To that point, right? And you can yank those out and then work with them from the LLMs. That's pretty fun.
Yeah.
Oh,
We
I
did
see.
that for a
Otter.ai is
hackathon.
great for checkpoint. Yeah, that's right. I'm familiar with Otter AI as well. Thank you, Peter. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. Again, just to make sure as we're going, give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen here. So where I did that kind of quick demo, I glossed over a bunch of stuff before. This time, I'm going to go just a little bit deeper into everything that is going on. Okay, so what I've done, again, this is just, thank you for that, Peter. I saw the thumbs up. This is, again, just a slight modification of the vector store RAG template. And by the way, when you're starting in Langflow, you can absolutely start with one of the blank flows. It's really not that hard, but I do suggest start with the template. Start with the basic prompting, the memory chatbot, things like that. It'll very quickly show you just how to build up capability. And the vector store RAG, honestly, is an extension, if you will. That's why I call it a RAG bot. It's like an extension of a chatbot with more capabilities that are then being augmented with our information in the vector store. Okay, so let's go ahead and set this up a little bit. So like before, we have one part of the flow that is this generative part of the flow. It's the part where I'm ingesting data and I'm converting it into vector embeddings and storing it into my RAG store. Now, one thing I want to point out here, if you remember before, I just had a single file and I was ingesting just that one PDF file. You are not limited. I want to be very clear about something. The UI in Langflow is this kind of quick development, no code style of doing things. But at the end of the day, it wouldn't be very useful if I was only limited to what's hard coded here in the UI, right? Obviously it has inputs and outputs that allows you to programmatically set these values. I will show you that in here in a couple minutes, right? So you're not limited to just a single PDF. You're also not limited to just files, right? Notice below, I actually yanked in, I'm scraping URLs from one of my old blogs that I have not contributed to in years. And, it's like, actually, to your point, Charna, like trying to remember some of the things you've done. I don't remember all of the material from that kind of thing, right? So what I did in this case was I also pulled those in. If you take here on the left-hand side, or take a look here on the left-hand side, you can see there's all sorts of different ways you can get data. And tying into something else that Charna said, underneath the hood, even though you could build out everything from a no-code standpoint, right? You do not need to be a programmer to use Langflow. But if you are, and if you are versed in Python, even just a little bit, you can get at all of the code, right? All of it is here. Matter of fact, every one of these components is actually a wholly contained Python module, or a wholly contained Python module. If you were to pull this out and put it into a module, it would work just fine, right? You can also modify these, right? So you can just come in here if I wanted to, and I can say, make some change, whatever, blah, 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 save that. And then I could just save that as a new component. And now I have a new component, right? So it's super flexible from that standpoint. You are not limited to the things that are only here that you see in the UI. Okay, great. So we have our PDF, but now I want to add something else. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and scrape in one of my old blog URLs. And then I'm going to pull it into this split text component. Now, this is part of the template. This is provided for you as part of the template, right? Now, what is this actually doing? What I'm going to do real quick, I'm going to run this part so I can talk through some things. I do just want to point out that as I do it, I have this collection name Langflow. This does not exist in my database, right? So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And what this component, this answers.t component will do, it will actually create the collection for me, right? So it's going to create the collection and put the data in. But while that's happening, I want to talk to what's going on here. And I should point out that the initial load, expect on your first run, especially like when I'm doing here, since I don't have the collection, it has to go create that. That takes a moment, right? Here, it's already done. But expect on your first load, it'll be a little slower than subsequent loads. Okay, so I've got data. I want to now chunk the data. What does this mean? This means, and you see this chunk size here, This means I'm going to iterate through whatever data was returned from my data inputs here. And I'm going to iterate through that data in 1,000-character lengths. And then I'm going to take those 1,000-character chunks and I'm going to convert those into vector embeddings. Now, you might ask, well, what vector embeddings? Which ones am I using? Where does this come into play? And you may have noticed right below it, you see this OpenAI embeddings component. Now, in Langflow, it is model agnostic. And what I mean by that is there are a ton of different providers, right? You are not limited to OpenAI or anything. As a matter of fact, there's even support for Llama if you're using local models, right? So there's a lot you can do here. But for this case, in our template, I'm using OpenAI, right? Now, notice here underneath model, there are a set of models. So we're saying that OpenAI has these 3 embedding models that we've exposed, 3 small, 3 large, and ADA02. Now, in this case, as part of the template, I'm using 3 small. Now, something I want to point out here, and this gets back to some of what Tara was talking about earlier, right? This is actually a super important step, and here's why. Whatever embedding model I choose to embed my data in my RAG store, I need to also ensure that when I'm querying, I'm also using the same model or at least be in the same family. If I try to mix and match, right? If I were to say embed in OpenAI's text embedding 3 small, but then later on I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to like throw Anthropic in here, that's probably not going to work very well, right? Now, interestingly enough, if there was something that was not based off the data in your RAG store, maybe you had some prompt chaining, maybe you have a decision tree that, like makes some conditional decision based off of some piece of your return data that says, oh, I want to go process that over here. Maybe then you can bring in a different model. But as far as when you are querying against your RAG store, you need to make sure that your models match or are in the same family, right? That's a really key part of this.
Yeah,
And then
I would
finally
say,
here, go ahead, Karna.
Yeah, I would say that like if you're thinking about any kind of search, right? Like if you were trying to use English language to search a French dictionary, you would not get back what you expect, right? It's similar to that. It's essentially encoding information differently. So if you're embedding a video with a video embedding model, that's so different
Yes,
than
good
embedding
point.
language, right? It's just a completely different representation. When I think about like how colors are represented, for example, we've got RGB, we've got CY, whatever. You cannot compare those two things. You can convert between them, but you can't compare them. And that's how I think about embedding models: purpose built for the thing you're trying to achieve and not compatible.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, I did see your comment, Greg, about the color scheme. So I did flip it. Hopefully this is better. And that is across the board. If anybody's having a hard time seeing the dark theme, but if this is also difficult to see, let me know. And by the way, Claude support. Yes, Peter, Anthropic. Am I thinking of the wrong? Yeah, duh, that was it. Yeah, there is support for Claude. 3.5 Sonnet is actually in there and such. So hopefully I answered your question, Peter. Okay, great. So we have our inputs, we chunk through the data. Now what's super cool here, you see this little inspection. So you have this little inspection icon in all these components. And since I ran through it, we can actually see the results. So now we can see that I have both results that came from the URL that I scraped and from the PDF. Now, one thing that Langflow is doing, you'll notice that there's this little data, these outputs, right? You see these little colors and these nodes and everything. And there are types, right, that they conform to. So when you're pulling data in, it'll actually convert into these data chunks. And when I look at those, you can see I have each of these. Now, what this is actually doing, it is separating the data out into useful like fields, source, title, things like that. For our particular needs, I'm interested in text mostly, right? And you can see each one of these is actually going to be a chunk of about 1,000 characters, right? Each one of these, this text is actually what is being converted into our vector embeddings and then stored in our RAG store. So let's go ahead and take a look real quick. Now, remember before I did not have the Langflow collection, right? That didn't exist. And now if I go to the Langflow collection, I should have a bunch of data, and I do, right? So you can see now that I have I'm going to open this up a little bit. There we go. Right, you can see that I've got the data itself, the content that was stored in embeddings, and then I've got these vector embeddings that represent that data mathematically, if you will, semantically. Great, so now I have a store that actually has some information in it. Okay. And by the way, just to point out, another little feature here of Langflow, you may notice that like for the database or for OpenAI, like there's OpenAI key, and you just see this kind of abstract OpenAI API key. What's going on there? Could I just go get an OpenAI key and paste it in the raw? I could. But one of the neat features is globals, or R globals, I should say. And when I create a global, I can actually store secure values like an API key, and then it's available to all of my components. So I don't have to keep pasting it all over the place and stuff like that. I just store it in a global. And that's exactly what I did here for the database. So this token and endpoint, if I go over to the database itself and I go to the overview, you'll see I have this endpoint and a token. I just copy that over, generate one, copy it into my global, and now it's available to all of my components. So it's a nice little feature for convenience, and it is, in fact, quite convenient. Okay, great. So I have data in my RAG store. Let's go ahead and take a look at the query flow. I'm going to kind of focus in here. I'm going to change up the question a little bit. This time it's going to be, when did I get married? All these things, like it is my domain knowledge. That's why I pulled it in, right? But again, this is something that if you just ask that question to the LLM, it's not going to know what you're talking about, right? So we can add this context. So what's going on in this part of the flow? And this really ties into something where you might be thinking, well, how do I bring this into my application, right? Because I need some types of inputs and outputs in the flow, in this workflow, in order for my application to be able to programmatically affect the input and then get the output, right? In this chat input, since I'm going to have a conversation with this RAG bot, this chat input is how I do that. And you'll see up in the top here, there's a set of inputs. Chat is pretty darn standard for this kind of use case. And I'm either going to type in something like it here, or again, it has an input where I can programmatically set it. And I'm going to show you the programmatic part here in a moment. Again, I have the same setup. The database, the RAG store, or the vector store of the same exact collection, the same thing with the embeddings. Now, why are we tied? Why do we need this tied in if I already have my data in my RAG store and we've already generated the embeddings? Because of this here. So when I ask a question or I have some query, I also need to convert that. I need to vectorize that right there into the same vector space as the data that's in my RAG store, so I can perform a vector similarity search. So this whole step, when I say build, it's actually now going to my vector store. It is converting this into an embedding. It is doing a vector search, and it's going to turn my top K results, right? So it's going to essentially turn the top results based off of the search. So if you notice that when I look at this, I have more data in here than what I returned, right? So it's just returning the top results based off the vector search, the question that I asked. And again, it's converting it into this data object that you see, and the text is pretty much what I'm interested in here. This is the stuff. These responses, this is when I want to feed in to the context of the LLM. So that ties into our next step, which is this parse data step. Notice that it is saying, hey, I want to parse the data from text. So again, I look at my data object, I have text. So I can do this nice little convenience thing, just wrap that in curlies, and then this will extract all the tests. Now, I didn't actually run that part, so let's go ahead and, actually, I'm going to run the whole flow is what I'm going to do. I'll let that finish for a second. That way I can talk to it as I'm going. So I'm just going to run this through. So now when I look at text, now it's pulled out all of the text from all of those results, right? So you can see this big chunk of text that came out. And these are the most relevant results based off of my vector search. Now this next part is actually, I think this is one of the coolest pieces, this prompt component. And here's what's going on. This would be the same exact thing as if I went to ChatGPT and I started typing this kind of stuff in, right? But notice how for these variable names, I have these curly braces. So a really neat convenience function in Langflow will allow you, if you have any variable, you can put curly braces around it, and that will then expose that as an input. So I could say something like this, some cool input, put curly braces around it, say check and save, boom. Now I have an input where I can just drag and drop and hook it up. Makes it super easy to wire these things up, right? Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of that one. Come back over here. We ran that through. So now if I look at my prompt, I have all of this context that was pulled in from my RAG store. And then the prompt actually says, given the context above, answer this question. And you can see it piped in my question. I'm actually going to pull that out. And again, from the UI standpoint, the context came out of this parse data right there. But that question That was the same one we started with, right? We started, when did I get married? I just pop that over and run it in. Now, what's super cool is I just pulled that prompt out. If I were to start a new chat GPT and I did this, actually, I clearly did not copy that properly. Let's try that again. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't realize it. Okay, my bad. I have it so zoomed in, I just didn't see it all. All right, so notice how now that I've given my LLM all this context and asked the question, now it actually can answer something that has some relevance, right? And it's the same exact thing we should see here in our answer. Okay, then finally, that prompt is wired up into our LLM. Again, in this particular case, I want to be using a model that is in the same family as how I vectorize my data. So again, I'm using OpenAI. But again, OpenAI is just part of the example, right? There are all sorts of different models you could choose from. And then finally, there's this chat output. So when I come out here, you can see this was me as I was hitting those builds, by the way. But you can see at the end, it was able to pull some information out that actually came from the blog, that I got some idea. Now, I don't in my blog mention exactly when I get married, but it inferred that from information it pulled up, right? So again, if I asked that without that particular context, it wouldn't have known this at all. Now, finally, I've got this flow working. I feel like, yeah, this is doing what I want it to do. How do I get this into my app? Look down at the lower right-hand corner. You see this API here, right? So what Langflow allows you to do, you have a bunch of options here, honestly. You could treat this as, just like a regular API endpoint and, curl, hit this in your app. You've got these tweaks here. These are actually the references to the components themselves, right? So let's say that I was curious and I'm like, how do I do this? How do I change this? If I edit the tweak, then it will automatically update the code. Right, so now I can see, oh, that's how I do it. So whether this is in the Python API, now I like using the Python API or the JavaScript API if I'm in active development. And what I mean by that is, in some of the apps I've been building, I am actively experimenting with different models and different flows and everything. I may not be ready to say version my flow. So I use this as an API server, and that way I can come in here and I can just be making all sorts of changes. I can just change. I can say, something, I actually don't want to use GPT-4o. I want to use 4 Turbo Preview, and I can just change it. And anytime I make subsequent requests from my app, it will reflect that, right? So that's one way that you could approach it. Another here, if you are in Python, you can actually export this whole flow as a JSON blob, and then you can import that into your app, right? And then that essentially brings all of the GenAI workflow logic right into your app, right? So you don't have to use Langflow as an API server if you don't want to. So there's all sorts of different options there. It really depends on your particular need. All right, so that's it from that standpoint. Like, how are we doing from that standpoint? I think I saw some stuff come in.
Yeah, let me pop some of these up here. So
we do have a little time left to hit some of these. Yeah, what do we have?
Yeah, so if I want to run Llama 3 on my PC, can I include inference of this model in Langflow? Absolutely. I put in the comments section in the Langflow docs that shows how to do the Llama local LLMs. So local support for LLMs is supported. If you don't see the component there for your specific model, as David had showed, like, it's pretty easy to just make a custom component and you set basically the API endpoint to localhost, right? And then it'll call into where it needs to go.
Awesome. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have in there?
This one for RAGStack Langflow, currently it seems there's only support for AstraDB, with support being planned for DSE and Cassandra. Any timelines? Actually, yes. We have I believe it was maybe 18 days ago that released the Cassandra component. So this one here. Yeah. And so this is in the latest version, and in the latest version of Langflow and RAGStack Langflow. Again, one is always slightly behind the other. And so you can use this to connect to Cassandra or to DSE.
Yeah. And also to point out, like, again, Langflow is store agnostic. Of course, we're biased, we're DataStax. We love Cassandra and AstraDB and all that kind of deal, but you're not limited to just those, right? You can use other vector stores and such like that. But a lot of our templates, I think the RAG one for sure will start you with AstraDB. And luckily, it's actually really easy to get going from that standpoint. But yes, the answer is yeah, you have support there. Okay. What about this last one, Charna? Maybe a little off topic. How good is Llama Index right now in creating agents for processing done data in RAG, for example, in comparison to LangGraph?
It's a great question. I have a couple of different answers to this. I don't know if our opinions will differ here. And I don't know how many folks know that you can actually use Llama Index and LangChain together. So if you've never used Llama Parse before, I've actually really like how well it does on getting data ready for GenAI. We also, Llama Index is one of our partners, LangChain is one of our partners, Unstructured is one of our partners. And all of these different tools have different sort of purposes for the kind of data and the kind of agent that you're trying to build. Now, that said, when I'm thinking about the customer base that I work with, the users of RAGStack, the majority of our users are using LangChain or Langflow. I don't know exactly why that is, but that's just the choice that they tend to make. And then we have some folks who are using Llama Index. It's not zero, but it is a fraction of those. I tend to work with enterprises though, so I can't speak for the developer community. So maybe David, you have a better answer of does it matter if you're enterprise? Does it matter if you're startup or an academic?
Oh, as far as Llama Index compared to LangChain?
Yeah.
So far, I actually just did a tour of a bunch of conferences. There's been a lot, and what's interesting is depending on the conference and the context, there are some different answers. At PyCon, compared to the AI World's Fair, I was having some different conversations. I will say that a lot more, I definitely run into a lot more folks who have at least tried LangChain, right? Yeah. But again, these are folks that I'm having conversations with, kind of on the front lines at these developer conferences and such like that. There are definitely some out there doing Llama Index, but kind of to your point earlier, it seems like it kind of depends on the use case. There are some that are poor compared to others. Like, an analogy I can make is on actual models, right? I know in some of my own development, I've been actually experimenting with doing language translation and all sorts of things and sentiment analysis and that kind of deal. And there are some models that are really good at doing the translation piece. But maybe they're not as good at like the sentiment analysis piece and that kind of deal. And so part of it is just kind of experimenting, right? And that's actually one of the neat things about Langflow. It allowed me to go and iterate through. So I don't have a direct answer from that standpoint. Other than I do know, I've heard more LangChain than I have heard Llama Index, but again, I think it's totally use case driven.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we don't have more questions, but I wanted to bring us back to the poll that we had put up earlier on what kind of data are people injecting into the prompt. So I'm looking at this and it looks like most people aren't doing general knowledge. Great. You probably don't need to be injecting general knowledge into the prompt. So glad we kind of glossed right over that. Detailed product information, things like medical. In these cases, you should be taking a look at RAG techniques using something like Colbert or something like hybrid search. So Astra, for example, supports metadata filters as well as vector. So if there's a specific product that you need to return exact word match, add that as metadata. You don't just store the vector, you store the metadata as well. You can filter on the metadata and do the vector search. So when you're doing something very detailed, very entity specific, know that basic RAG sometimes is not going to work, especially as your data set gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you have more and more products to recognize. Hyperlink support articles. If you haven't tried the coarse-grained knowledge graph or graph RAG approach, take a look at it. We just contributed it to LangChain. It's open source with 2 code changes of lines of code changed. You can stand up a graph with your vector data linked to your other data, and there's some helper functions in there to generate those edges for you. Same with chunks from very long PDFs. Like if the problem you're running into is that you're getting the right chunk back, but you're missing the surrounding context, graph can be very useful. You could say, oh, this chunk was on the same page and it was in this document, right? So sometimes, depending on the complexity of the question you're answering, you may need to pull back the entire document, or you may just need to bring back that page, right? Think about the different kinds of ways that you can relate this information together when you can get semantic similarity back, but you can't get some of the related information that you need. Numerical data. I am so excited that you guys are doing numerical data. We were talking about this the other day, David, where, language embedding model does not embed numerical data the same way that it embeds language data.
Right.
The way that you store and retrieve this information is going to be incredibly important. In fact, you may not vectorize this data at all. You may instead want to do something like text to CQL or text to SQL in order to actually get that language query to generate a structured query to pull the exact data back, right? This type of numerical data isn't always going to, I don't know, have you ever tried to have ChatGPT count the words for a little snippet? Oh my God.
It has challenges.
It can't do it. I try to shorten the description of my podcast all the time. Cannot be done. Do it in less than 200 words. It won't do it, right? It's just not the same information. So consider things like text to CQL, text to SQL, in order to retrieve that information in a way that's going to preserve the actual data that you need to inject into the prompt.
Yeah, and by the way, I know everybody, we're essentially at time. However, there is a question here in QA that I can answer real fast. There was another one there in the comments. So I'm going to go ahead and just knock one of these out real fast. So we tried using one of the other vector store blocks. I'm going to start answering this. Weaviate on RAGStack Langflow, but it did not work. It did work on open source Langflow. The response we received on Stack Overflow was that RAGStack Langflow will only work for Aster DSE. Cassandra as vector store. Can you please confirm whether this is true? No, it's not limited to only DataStax products. Now, one thing to point out is that, as Charna mentioned earlier, because of the nature of RAGStack and the fact that all the libraries and things like that, they go through all sorts of extensive testing and they're curated and stuff, the version may lag slightly behind open source. But here's a fun trick for you. So, by the way, it should work. So I will make sure to get that information back to the team if they're not already aware. But here's a neat trick for you. Remember, all of this stuff is just code, right? Underneath the hood. So let's say you're in the open source version and you're like, hey, the Weaviate one works. Just copy the code. You can go then into, you can do this a couple different ways. You can actually go for a custom component if you want. Pop the code in. Oh, wait, I didn't actually copy it from here. So let me just do that to illustrate this. Copy it. And I can go into a custom component, paste it, do this, rename it, and say Weaviate or whatever it is, right? And now when here we go. Now when I save this, I now have a component, right? That is actually, I can share this across any of my flows. I can also upload it. One thing I didn't mention is there is in fact a Langflow store, is a community store where all sorts of folks can actually store their own flow. You can upload your flows and your components and such. So it could just be that, this would be a way that you can get that. But it is, if you see something like that, again, if it's an open source and it's working, the way that the process goes, RAGStack isn't very far behind. So it will probably resolve itself. But yes, if you do see something like that, you should be able to pull it from one and go right to the other. One last thing I'm going to say about this here, the store is a really neat way. Like when I have a flow that is in a good place and I'm like, something, I want to hold on to this for posterity, or maybe I want to version it. If I go to share, I can say share flow. Once I've hooked up my store with my API key, it will automatically upload that. And so if I come over to here to those that are created by me, I need to log in apparently. Been a minute, probably timed out. There we go. Do this again. Okay. If I go back to, I want the store. There we go. If I come those that are created by me, you can see these are flows that I've been uploading. So this is a really neat way. I can version things, put them up there. These are not public, right? When you say share, it's set by default, but you can uncheck that and keep them for yourself. So that's a nice way you can kind of share components. So if you did have a case where you did see something like that, or maybe you made a custom component in one, but you wanted it in the other one, share it up to the store, just use the store and pull it down, right? It's super easy from that standpoint. Let's see. And then the last one, I think I saw GitMaxC actually put it into the QA, which was you used a web scraper in your demo for ingestion. Recently, I saw you all have integrated with Firecrawl. Can Firecrawl be used in place of web scraper? I don't see why not. Again, these components are super flexible. I don't know, Cherna, if you know, I don't personally know about the Firecrawl component or an integration there. But again, this is one of those cases where as that kind of capability is added into Langflow, if it is, a component may show up, it may be in the store, but you can modify these to do whatever. And then I actually did one with 11 Labs. I was doing voice transcription. And so I just made a very quick component with 11 Labs, right? And so you can just upload that stuff up. So anyway, yeah, it's flexible. I think there are definitely some options for you there. All right, and I do know that we are at time. I know we've gone a little over. I want to be respectful of that. I think at this point, Charna, unless you want to follow up with anything, if there are any questions or whatever we didn't get to, we can just follow up in email and get those answered for everybody.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, with that, thank you, everybody, for your attention today. We appreciate you coming on. Thank you, Charna, for bringing the information. I think given some conversations, we may do some live streams on some GraphRag, right? And
yeah. I'd love to show some examples. Like it's sort of once you see it for the first time, you're like, hold on. I can do so much with this. It's a pretty great method.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. That's it for the live stream today, and we'll see you in the future. Take care. Bye.